Sapode when the generals laughed. In the summer of 1944, Europe was a continent in ruins. The Allied armies had broken through the beaches of Normandy and were pushing east, deeper into France. At the tip of that advance was a man whose name struck both awe and fear, General George S. Patton. Patton's Third Army was a force of nature, fast, aggressive, and unstoppable. His tanks swept across the countryside, breaking German lines, capturing towns, liberating villages. But speed came with a cost: fuel. Each of Patton's Sherman tanks drank a gallon of gasoline for every mile it moved. Every truck, every jeep, every armored car needed fuel, bullets, rations, and spare parts. And as Patton's men raced across France, they were outrunning their own supply lines. The Germans watched from a distance and laughed. To them, the idea of an army moving so fast without a solid logistics plan was madness. "Let the Americans run," they said. "They'll starve themselves soon enough." They had no idea that behind the thunder of Patton's tanks, another army, Sakaz, a silent army, was being built. This was not an army of soldiers with rifles, but of drivers, mechanics, and dispatchers. Men who would fight their war not with bullets, but with engines. Their weapon was the truck, their battlefield, the open road. They called it the Red Ball Express. It began as a desperate experiment, a 700-mile-long supply line stretching from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines of France. Convoys of olive-drab trucks painted with a red circle, the Red Ball, to mark their priority status, roared day and night, hauling everything from fuel and food to ammunition and medical supplies. Every 24 hours, over 6,000 vehicles thundered down narrow French roads. Drivers were told to never stop, never turn back, and never fall behind schedule. Broken bridges, potholes, and German air raids didn't matter. The supplies had to reach Patton. At first, even the Allied High Command thought it was impossible. Europe's railways were destroyed, ports were jammed with supplies, and roads were a muddy mess. But one group refused to quit. The truckers of the Red Ball Express, many of them African-American soldiers who had volunteered for one of the toughest, most dangerous jobs of the war. These men worked around the clock, often with little sleep and no hot food. They drove through fog, rain, and darkness, headlights off to avoid German fighters, following only the dim glow of the truck ahead. They were the lifeline of the Allied advance. General Eisenhower would later say, "Without the Red Ball Express, the Allies could not have won the war." But in August 1944, as it began, few believed it would succeed. The Germans were regrouping, Paris was still in turmoil, and every mile forward demanded more gasoline, more tires, more courage. Yet on those narrow roads of northern France, a new kind of hero was emerging. Ordinary men doing extraordinary things in extraordinary times. Their story, the story of the Red Ball Express, had just begun. Fueling the Blitz, the road warriors of the Red Ball Express. By late August 1944, the thunder of Patton's tanks echoed through France. Every mile they gained brought them closer to Germany and farther from their supplies. The Red Ball Express was the only thing keeping them alive. Convoys ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. When one column reached its destination, another was already on the way. Trucks loaded with 55-gallon drums of gasoline, stacked high and lashed with rope, barreled down dirt roads barely wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass. The men joked that if one truck exploded, the whole line would light up like a fireworks show. And yet they drove on. Most drivers were barely out of their teens. Many had never left home before. They came from farms in Alabama, city streets in New York, dusty towns in Texas. Now they were part of something far bigger, an unbroken chain of courage. that stretched from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines of Lorraine. Each day brought a new challenge. Mud turned roads into rivers. German fighter planes hunted them from above. Bridges had to be rebuilt overnight after enemy raids. When tires blew, drivers fixed them under shell fire. Sleep was a luxury. Coffee and adrenaline were the only fuel they could count on. Among the thousands who drove the Red Ball routes were nearly 75% African-American soldiers. Segregated by law but united by duty, they proved that courage had no color. One driver later recalled, "We weren't just fighting Hitler. We were fighting the idea that we couldn't do the job." And they did. Convoys became moving miracles of coordination. Each truck carried an identification number, each route was timed down to the minute, and each driver knew the rule: no matter what happens, keep moving. If a truck broke down, another pushed it aside. If a bridge collapsed, engineers built a new one within hours. The rhythm never stopped. By September 1944, the Red Ball Express was moving over 12,000 tons of supplies every day. To put that in perspective, that's enough fuel, food, and ammunition to support 500,000 soldiers on the move. The road network itself became legendary. From Saint-Lô to Chartres, then to Paris, and onward to the Belgian border, bright red signs marked Red Ball Route, military traffic only. No civilian vehicles were allowed. The roads belonged to the truckers and the thunder they carried. Still, the pace was brutal. Engines overheated, transmissions blew out, and fuel leaks turned cabs into fire traps. Yet morale stayed high. Music and laughter filled the checkpoints at night. Soldiers carved slogans into their dashboards. "Keep 'em rolling," Patton's lifeline, Hitler's gas bill. Sometimes they saw Patton himself, standing beside the road watching convoys thunder by, his polished helmet gleaming. He'd raise his gloved hand and salute. To the truckers, that meant everything. They knew that without them, even Patton's mighty Third Army would grind to a halt. As September rolled on, the weather turned cold and wet. The fields of France became seas of mud. But still the Red Ball moved, mile after mile, day after day. When asked how they did it, one driver said simply, "We just kept driving. If Patton was going to make history, someone had to bring him the gas." By autumn 1944, the laughter of the German generals had gone silent. They had underestimated the one thing that made the U.S. Army unstoppable: its ability to move, to adapt, and to never quit. The Red Ball Express had become the beating heart of the Allied advance. But the hardest days were still to come. The final push and the legacy of the Red Ball Express. As the cold winds of autumn swept across Europe in late 1944, the Red Ball Express was reaching its limit. Trucks were worn out, drivers were exhausted, and every mile forward seemed harder than the one before. But the war wasn't slowing down. Patton's tanks were pressing toward the German border, and the Battle of the Bulge was only weeks away. The Red Ball drivers knew they couldn't stop, not even for a moment. They were no longer just delivering fuel and food. They were keeping an entire army alive. At times, it felt like the roads themselves were alive. Endless ribbons of mud and ice, crawling with headlights and engines through the night. Convoys rumbled past burning villages and broken bridges. German artillery occasionally found them, but they kept going. The sound of their engines was more than noise. It was a promise. The front would not fall silent. Patton understood that. He once told his staff, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have got to have gas." And the Red Ball Express made sure he never ran dry. Even when supplies thinned and weather worsened, the convoys rolled on, through sleet, fog, and gunfire. Sometimes they drove with bullet holes in the windshields, sometimes with flat tires, sometimes with no headlights at all. They improvised, they repaired, they endured. And when they finally reached the front lines, the tank crews would cheer. They knew that without those men and their trucks, the advance would die right there in the mud. By the time the Red Ball Express ended in November 1944, it had delivered more than 400,000 tons of supplies across France. At its peak, over 6,000 trucks and 23,000 drivers were on the move every day. It was one of the most extraordinary logistical operations in military history. Built almost overnight, run largely by men who'd never imagined themselves as heroes. But heroes they were. The Red Ball drivers proved that wars are not won only by those who pull the trigger, but also by those who keep the trigger loaded. Their courage kept the wheels of victory turning. And though many of them never made headlines, their work turned the tide of the war. After the fighting ended, most of those soldiers went home quietly. They traded their helmets for the work caps, their engines for factory floors. Yet they carried with them a pride few others could understand, the pride of knowing they had fueled freedom itself. In later years, historians would call the Red Ball Express a marvel of logistics, but to the men who lived it, it was something deeper, a brotherhood forged in gasoline and grit, forged in the roar of engines and the fear of silence. They had driven through hell and come out the other side. When the Germans laughed at American logistics, they saw only confusion. They didn't see the determination that lay beneath, the mechanics who worked without rest, the drivers who risked everything on those dark roads, the officers who believed that anything was possible. That was America's secret weapon, not just technology or numbers, but relentless spirit. Today, the Red Ball Express is remembered as the pulse of victory. In museums and memorials across France, old road signs still bear the words, "Red Ball Route, military traffic only." Rusty fuel cans and weathered photographs tell a story of ordinary men doing extraordinary things. Every time a veteran spoke about it, their eyes lit up. They remembered the nights when engines hummed like thunder, when friendships were born in the dark, and when the fate of an army rested on the hands gripping a steering wheel. So the next time you see a long convoy of trucks rolling down a highway, imagine 1944. Imagine those soldiers in their worn uniforms, headlights off, hands tight on the wheel, somewhere in the rain-soaked fields of France. They weren't just driving trucks. They were driving history forward. And that, more than anything, is why the Red Ball Express will never be forgotten.